I used to think betrayal was something that happened in a single moment. One discovery. One conversation. One clear point where everything breaks. But that's not really how it feels. For me, it was slower than that. Quieter. The real damage didn't start the day I found out. It started afterward, when all the memories began to change. I still remember the first morning when the house felt unfamiliar. Nothing had physically changed. The furniture was the same. The same coffee mug sat in the cabinet. The same sunlight came through the kitchen window. But it didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a set. Like a place where I had spent years playing the role of someone who believed everything was real. I would walk through the rooms and catch myself thinking about ordinary things that used to make me happy. The way she used to hum while cooking. The lazy weekends where we didn't bother getting dressed until noon. Even the small arguments that used to end with both of us laughing because neither of us could stay mad very long. Those memories used to feel warm. Now they felt contaminated. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Was any of it real? Or had I just been living inside a story she stopped believing in long before I realized it? That question is dangerous, by the way. Once it gets into your head, it spreads into everything. Our wedding photos started to look strange to me. I would stare at them and wonder what she was thinking that day. Whether the smile I remembered so clearly meant the same thing to her that it meant to me. Even the good memories stopped feeling safe. It's a strange thing when your past starts slipping away from you like that. You begin to doubt moments that once felt certain. And that doubt doesn't stay neatly contained. It follows you everywhere. I started noticing it in small ways. I couldn't concentrate at work anymore. I would read the same email 3 times and still not remember what it said. Sometimes I'd finish errands and just sit in the car for a while, staring at nothing. Not because I was tired. Because going home didn't feel normal anymore. Home felt like a place where something important had already been taken, and I was only now realizing what was missing. But the worst part wasn't the anger. It wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the realization that the version of my life I believed in might never have existed the way I thought it did. People talk about infidelity like it's the end of a relationship. What they don't tell you is that it does something much stranger than that. It rewrites your memory. Suddenly every moment from the past starts asking questions you can't answer. And once you notice that feeling, you can't unnotice it. Because the truth is, the whole thing didn't begin with the discovery. It began earlier. With something so small I almost ignored it. A moment that didn't feel like proof. Just a tiny flicker of discomfort that I told myself not to overthink. Looking back now, that was the first crack. And once I saw it, the entire story started to come apart. But before I explain how that happened, let me say one quick thing. If you're someone who finds these kinds of stories interesting, the messy ones about betrayal, trust, and the moments that change people forever, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. This channel dives into real human situations where nothing is simple, nobody is perfect, and the truth usually comes out in ways no one expects. If stories like this keep you thinking long after they end, go ahead and hit subscribe, leave a like, and share the video with someone who enjoys these kinds of conversations too. Alright. Now, about that moment. The one tiny thing I noticed that didn't seem important at the time. That's where this actually started. If I'm being honest, the beginning of our relationship felt ordinary in the best possible way. There wasn't some dramatic moment where everything suddenly made sense. No instant fireworks. No story that people would lean in to hear at parties. It just worked. We met during a period of my life that felt stable. I had settled into a routine I understood. My days were predictable. Work, home, weekends that mostly looked the same from one month to the next. At the time, I thought predictability was boring. Now I realize it was peace. She came into that routine gradually. At first it was just casual conversations and shared time that didn't feel heavy or complicated. She was easy to talk to. The kind of person who could make a quiet evening feel full without trying too hard. I remember thinking she had a calming presence. Not exciting in a chaotic way. Steady. That mattered to me more than I probably admitted at the time. Our early conversations weren't deep confessions or dramatic bonding moments. They were small things. Complaints about work. Stories about family. Opinions about things that didn't really matter. But the more we talked, the easier it felt to keep talking. That's how it grew. Not through big declarations, but through familiarity. Before long, we had our own small patterns. Certain nights when we always saw each other. Little habits that formed without either of us planning them. Places we returned to simply because we had already been there once together. Those routines started to feel important. I remember the first time I noticed that she had become part of my daily thoughts. It wasn't anything dramatic. I was just running errands and caught myself wondering what she would say about something I had seen. That small thought felt strangely comforting. Like my life had quietly expanded. Over time, that feeling deepened. Friends noticed it before I did. They would make comments about how relaxed I seemed around her. How different my mood was compared to earlier relationships I had talked about. One friend joked once, "You look like someone who finally stopped looking." At the time, I laughed it off. But privately, I wondered if they might be right. She had this way of making things feel settled. Arguments were rare. When we disagreed, it usually ended with one of us shrugging and letting it go. Neither of us liked drawn-out conflict. I thought that meant we were compatible. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if it meant something else. But back then, it felt like a sign that we were building something solid. Eventually our lives started blending in more permanent ways. Plans became shared plans. The future stopped being something I imagined alone. We talked about the kinds of things people talk about when they believe they're building a life together. Where we might want to live long term. What our routines might look like years down the line. None of it felt rushed. That's probably why it felt so believable. Nothing about our relationship seemed fragile. It felt stable enough that I stopped questioning it. And when trust grows slowly like that, it becomes part of your normal thinking. You stop analyzing every little thing. You stop looking for warning signs. You simply assume the person beside you is standing on the same ground you are. At some point, I realized I had begun measuring parts of my life through that relationship. Work stress felt smaller because I had someone to talk to about it. Good news felt bigger because I had someone to share it with. It's strange how quickly that kind of emotional structure becomes invisible. You don't notice it forming. You just wake up one day and realize your entire sense of stability includes another person. And once that happens, you stop imagining what your life would look like without them. Back then, the idea never even crossed my mind. Because if you had asked me during those years whether I trusted her, I wouldn't have hesitated. Not even for a second. When I first met her, nothing about it felt dramatic. There wasn't some big moment where the room went quiet or where I instantly knew my life was about to change. It was simpler than that. We were introduced through mutual friends during a small gathering. I remember thinking she seemed easy to talk to. Calm. Comfortable in a way that didn't feel forced. Some people try too hard when they meet someone new. She didn't. We started talking about ordinary things. Work. Movies. The usual small talk people use when they're trying to figure each other out. At some point the conversation drifted into stories about our childhoods. Then into the kinds of plans people make when they're trying to imagine what their future might look like. Nothing serious. Just the kind of conversation that stretches longer than you expect. After that night we stayed in touch. At first it was occasional messages. Checking in. Sharing something funny we had seen online. Asking how the other person's week was going. Then those conversations started happening more often. I noticed that talking to her felt easy. There wasn't much effort involved. We didn't have to perform for each other. If there was silence, it didn't feel uncomfortable. Eventually we started spending time together on purpose. Simple things at first. Coffee after work. Walking through a park nearby. Sitting in quiet restaurants where neither of us felt rushed to leave. Looking back now, what I remember most is the calm. Our relationship didn't grow out of chaos or excitement. It grew out of consistency. She showed up when she said she would. If she promised to call, she called. If something bothered her, she talked about it. Those things might sound small, but they build trust faster than big romantic gestures ever could. Over time, those routines started to feel normal. Expected. There were nights we'd cook together, even though neither of us was particularly good at it. We'd laugh when things burned or when we followed a recipe wrong. I remember thinking those moments were what people meant when they talked about building a life with someone. Nothing flashy. Just two people slowly building habits around each other. Eventually our lives started overlapping in more permanent ways. We spent holidays together. Met each other's families. Shared plans about where we thought we might be a few years down the road. Friends started referring to us as a unit. If someone invited one of us somewhere, they usually assumed the other would come too. I didn't question any of it. It all felt natural. At some point we stopped talking about the future as two separate things. It became our future. Where we might live. What kind of life we wanted. The things we thought we'd eventually accomplish together. That kind of thinking changes the way you see someone. They stop feeling like a person you're dating. They start feeling like the person standing next to you in the life you're building. And when that shift happens, something else changes too. Your trust becomes deeper than simple belief. It becomes dependence. Not in an unhealthy way. Just the quiet understanding that the person beside you is someone you can lean on when life becomes complicated. She became the person I told things to first. Good news. Bad news. Small frustrations from work. Random thoughts that didn't seem important but felt easier to share than keep to myself. And she did the same. At least that's what I believed at the time. When you live like that for long enough, your lives start weaving together in ways you barely notice. Your routines sync up. Your plans overlap. Your sense of stability becomes connected to the presence of the other person. Looking back, that's the part people rarely talk about when relationships fall apart. The betrayal hurts. Of course it does. But the deeper damage comes from realizing how much of your emotional structure you quietly built around someone who might not have been building the same thing. At the time, though, I didn't see any of that. All I saw was someone who had become the most reliable part of my life. And the longer that continued, the more certain I became that what we had was permanent. That the trust between us had become strong enough to survive anything. At least. That's what I believed back then. For a long time, nothing about our relationship felt unstable. That's why the early signs were so easy to ignore. They didn't arrive all at once. They didn't look dramatic. If anything, they felt too small to be worth mentioning. Just little shifts in behavior that could be explained away if you didn't look too closely. At first it was changes in conversation. Nothing obvious. She still talked about her day, still asked about mine. But sometimes I noticed she seemed distracted. Like part of her attention was somewhere else. I remember one night sitting across from her while she scrolled through her phone. I said something about work. Something that had been bothering me for most of the day. She nodded and said, "Yeah, that sounds frustrating." But she didn't look up. At the time I didn't think much of it. Everyone gets distracted sometimes. Still, the moment stuck with me longer than it should have. Then there were the schedule changes. Again, nothing dramatic. Just occasional evenings where she said she needed to stay out later than usual. Extra errands. Last-minute plans that came up unexpectedly. Her explanations were always reasonable. Work ran long. I promised someone I'd help with something. It's probably nothing, I'll tell you about it later. None of those things are suspicious by themselves. And that's exactly why they worked. Because when trust already exists, your mind fills in the gaps with harmless explanations. You assume everything makes sense. Another thing I noticed was the way certain conversations started ending more quickly than they used to. If I asked a follow-up question about something she mentioned earlier, she'd sometimes shrug it off. It's not really important. Or, I probably explained it badly the first time. Little comments like that. Each one harmless on its own. But slowly, without realizing it, I started feeling like I was standing slightly outside certain parts of her life. Not completely shut out. Just, not fully included. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Relationships go through phases. People get busy. Energy shifts. That's normal. I didn't want to be the kind of person who overanalyzed every detail. So I ignored the feeling. But the strange thing about intuition is that it doesn't disappear just because you refuse to examine it. It waits. It lingers quietly in the background. And every time something slightly off happens again, it grows a little louder. I started noticing small pauses when she answered certain questions. Nothing obvious. Just half-second hesitations. Like she was choosing her words carefully. One evening I mentioned it casually. You seem tired lately. She gave a quick smile. Just work. It's been busy. That answer should have settled the conversation. Instead it left me with a strange, unsettled feeling I couldn't explain. Because the words sounded right. But something about the way she said them didn't. I kept that thought to myself. No accusations. No confrontation. At that point I didn't even know what I would accuse her of. All I had was a vague sense that something in the rhythm of our life had changed. And changes in rhythm are easy to miss when you're used to the music. Weeks passed like that. Most days still felt normal. We still shared meals. Still talked about plans. Still moved through our routines together. Which made the quiet moments of unease feel almost unreasonable. Like I was inventing problems that didn't exist. Eventually I convinced myself that was probably the truth. That the strange feeling in the back of my mind was nothing more than stress or overthinking. And for a while, that explanation was enough. Until the night something small happened. Something so minor that any reasonable person could have ignored it. At the time, I almost did. But for reasons I still don't completely understand. That tiny moment refused to leave my mind. The moment everything changed didn't arrive the way people expect. There was no dramatic confrontation. No obvious confession. No scene where someone finally admits the truth. It happened quietly. Almost accidentally. I remember the evening clearly because nothing about it felt unusual at first. We had both been busy that day. She came home later than usual, said she was tired, and mentioned she still had a few things to finish before going to bed. That kind of thing had become normal lately. I didn't question it. We talked for a little while in the kitchen. Nothing serious. Just small conversation about the day. At some point she stepped away to take a call in the other room. I didn't pay attention to the conversation itself. Her voice was low, and I wasn't trying to listen. But I did notice something strange. The tone. It was softer than usual. Careful. Almost like she was speaking to someone she didn't want to disturb. I told myself it was probably work. That explanation made sense. So I let it go. Later that night she went to bed early. Said she was exhausted. I stayed up a little longer, scrolling through my phone, not really focused on anything. Just killing time the way people do when they're not ready to sleep yet. Eventually I got up to grab a glass of water. That's when I noticed her phone on the counter. Normally I wouldn't have thought twice about it. We'd never been the kind of couple who hid our devices from each other. Phones sat around the house all the time. But that night something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the earlier phone call. Maybe it was the quiet feeling that had been following me for weeks. Whatever it was, I stopped for a moment longer than I should have. The screen lit up. A notification. Just a name. No message visible yet. For a second I simply stared at it. It was a name I didn't recognize. That alone shouldn't have meant anything. People have coworkers, acquaintances, old friends. But something about it felt out of place. I told myself to ignore it. To walk away. That looking at someone else's messages, even someone you trust, crosses a line. But that strange feeling in the back of my mind was louder now. So I picked up the phone. Even now, remembering that moment makes me uncomfortable. Because part of me knows that was the point where things became irreversible. The screen unlocked easily. And for a moment I hesitated. Not because I expected to find anything. But because once you start looking for answers like that, you can't go back to not knowing. I opened the conversation. At first, nothing made sense. Just fragments. Short messages. Inside jokes I didn't understand. I scrolled slowly, trying to piece together the context. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A message referencing a moment I had no memory of. Something that had apparently happened on a night when she told me she was working late. I remember reading the sentence 3 or 4 times. Not because it was complicated. Because my brain refused to process it. It felt like staring at a photograph where something was wrong but you couldn't immediately explain why. Then another message. And another. Each one removing a little more doubt. Until the truth was sitting there in front of me, plain and undeniable. I felt strangely calm at first. Not angry. Not even shocked. Just hollow. Like the ground under my life had suddenly shifted, and my mind hadn't caught up yet. I stood there in the kitchen holding her phone, staring at words that clearly belonged to a version of her life I knew nothing about. A hidden timeline running beside the one I thought we shared. In that moment I realized something that hurt more than the messages themselves. This hadn't started recently. The conversation stretched back further than I expected. Far enough that it overlapped with memories I had always considered safe. Dinner dates. Trips we took together. Quiet evenings where I believed everything between us was exactly what it seemed. Now those same memories felt different. Like photographs where someone had quietly altered the background. I placed the phone back exactly where I found it. For a long time I just stood there. Trying to figure out whether what I had just seen was real. Because once that realization settles in, something inside you shifts. The person you thought you knew becomes a stranger. And the life you thought you were living suddenly looks like a story someone else was writing behind your back. That was the moment the illusion finally cracked. Even though, at the time, I still hadn't decided what I was going to do with the truth. I didn't confront her that night. I thought about it. More than once. But the longer I stood there in the kitchen, the clearer it became that I wasn't ready for the conversation that would follow. Once you say certain things out loud, you can't take them back. And I still wasn't sure what I had just walked into. So I went to bed. She was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. The room was quiet except for the slow rhythm of her breathing. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling, replaying the messages I had seen. My mind kept trying to rearrange them into something less damaging. Some explanation that would make the whole thing smaller. But every version I imagined collapsed under its own weight. Eventually I stopped trying to sleep. Morning came slowly. When she woke up, everything looked normal on the surface. The same routine. The same casual conversation while we got ready for the day. At one point she asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. And as strange as it sounds, that moment felt surreal. Because the person standing a few feet away from me was the same person I had trusted for years. The same voice, the same gestures. But now I knew something about her that she didn't know I knew. It felt like we were both standing in the same room while living inside two completely different realities. I lasted until the evening. The entire day I kept thinking about whether I should say anything. Part of me wanted to avoid it completely, to pretend I hadn't seen what I saw. But that kind of pretending doesn't last. Eventually we were sitting in the living room together. She was scrolling through something on her phone again. I heard myself ask the question before I fully decided to. Who is he? She looked up. At first her expression was just confusion. What do you mean? I held her gaze for a moment. I saw the messages. For a second neither of us spoke. It's strange how quiet a room can feel when something important has just been said. Her face changed slowly. Not dramatic panic. Not instant denial. Just a small tightening around her eyes. You went through my phone? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unreasonable. Because of the way she said it. I remember answering quietly. It was sitting on the counter. Another pause. Then she set the phone down. Her shoulders lifted slightly in a tired kind of shrug. It's not what you think. That sentence is almost expected in moments like that. People say it automatically, like a reflex. But hearing it in real life felt different. Because I had already seen enough to know what I thought. What is it then? I asked. She rubbed her forehead. It just happened. The explanation came slowly after that. Broken pieces of sentences. We started talking. I didn't mean for it to turn into anything. It wasn't supposed to get complicated. None of it felt like a real answer. At one point I asked how long it had been going on. She hesitated before answering. That hesitation told me more than the actual number would have. I remember saying, so all those nights you said you were working late. She didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. She just looked down at the floor. The silence between us grew heavier with every second. Eventually she said something that stuck with me more than anything else. I didn't think you'd find out like this. Not I'm sorry. Not I made a mistake. Just that. As if the real problem was the timing of the discovery. After that, the conversation lost its shape. There were attempts at explanations, half-formed apologies, sentences that didn't quite finish. But something inside me had already gone quiet. The anger I expected to feel never really arrived. Instead there was this strange sense of distance. Like I was watching the end of someone else's relationship instead of my own. By the end of the night we both understood what was happening without saying it directly. Things started changing quickly after that. Practical conversations. Who would stay where? What needed to be sorted out? It's amazing how fast a shared life turns into a list of logistical decisions. The routines that once felt permanent disappeared almost overnight. And as those pieces started falling apart, one realization kept returning to me again and again. The relationship I thought I was protecting had already been gone for a while. I had just been the last person to realize it. Time has a strange way of changing the shape of things. In the beginning, after everything fell apart, my mind was focused on the immediate damage. The conversations. The logistics. The quiet process of separating two lives that had been woven together for years. There were practical things to figure out. Living arrangements. Shared responsibilities. Conversations with people who noticed something had changed but didn't know how to ask about it. Those early weeks felt mechanical. You wake up. You go through the motions. You answer questions carefully without saying more than you're ready to say. At first, I thought the hardest part had already happened. I was wrong. The real impact showed up later, when life started to slow down again. That's when my mind began revisiting things I hadn't paid attention to before. Moments that once felt ordinary started to look different in hindsight. Little details I had brushed off suddenly stood out. The nights she came home later than usual. The way certain conversations had ended quickly. Those small pauses when she answered questions. At the time, each one seemed harmless. But when you look at them after the truth comes out, they line up in ways you can't ignore. I remember sitting alone one evening months later, thinking about how many times I had sensed something was slightly off. Not enough to accuse anyone. But enough to feel that quiet discomfort. Back then I had pushed those feelings aside. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself trust meant not questioning every little thing. Now I understood something I hadn't understood before. Intuition doesn't always show up as certainty. Sometimes it appears as a small voice you convince yourself to ignore. And the strange part is, recognizing that later didn't bring relief. It brought a different kind of frustration. Because it meant the signs had been there. Just not in ways that felt obvious at the time. As more time passed, my view of the relationship started shifting in other ways too. Not all of the memories felt ruined anymore. At first, everything looked contaminated by the betrayal. Like the entire history of our relationship had been built on something false. But distance changes perspective. Some memories eventually returned to their original shape. Moments where I knew, at least from my side, the emotions had been genuine. The laughter. The quiet evenings. The sense of stability I once felt. Those things were real for me. Even if they weren't real in the same way for her. Understanding that took longer than I expected. Because betrayal has a way of making you question your own judgment. You start wondering if you missed something obvious. If you were naive. If the person you trusted had been someone entirely different all along. But life doesn't usually work in such clean explanations. People can care about you and still hurt you. They can mean what they say in one moment and contradict it later. That realization doesn't erase the damage. But it does make the story more complicated than simple betrayal. Eventually, the anger faded. Not completely, but enough that it stopped controlling my thoughts. What stayed behind was something quieter. A new awareness about how fragile trust actually is. Once it breaks, it doesn't just affect the present. It changes how you remember the past and how carefully you approach the future. And if you've ever experienced something like this, or you find yourself thinking about the complicated ways trust can fall apart, take a second to support the channel. Stories like these are shared here to open honest conversations about relationships, loyalty, and the gray areas people rarely talk about. If this story resonates with you, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment below. Hearing different perspectives often reveals just how many people have faced similar moments. Because the truth is, situations like this are rarely simple. And sometimes understanding them takes more than one point of view. Even now, after everything that happened, I still catch myself revisiting certain moments. Not to change them. Just to understand them a little better. And every time I do, I'm reminded of one uncomfortable fact. The truth doesn't always arrive when the story begins. Sometimes it only becomes clear long after everything is already over. It's strange how quiet life becomes after something like that. Not immediately. In the beginning there's noise. Conversations, explanations, the practical chaos of two people untangling a life that used to be shared. There are questions from friends. Awkward pauses during family calls. Long nights where your mind keeps circling the same thoughts without ever landing anywhere useful. But eventually all of that fades. And what's left behind is something quieter. Space. I didn't notice it right away, but after a while the silence in my home stopped feeling uncomfortable. The routines that once felt empty slowly turned into something stable again. I started rebuilding small habits. Cooking dinner without expecting someone else to walk through the door. Watching a movie without pausing to ask what the other person thought about it. Making plans for the future that only involved one schedule instead of two. At first those things felt strange. Then they started to feel normal. What surprised me most was how my thoughts about the relationship changed over time. In the beginning I kept replaying everything, trying to figure out exactly where things went wrong. I looked for a single moment I could point to. A decision, a conversation, some turning point that explained the whole thing. But real life rarely gives you answers that clean. There wasn't one moment where everything broke. There were probably dozens of small ones. Choices made quietly. Conversations avoided. Feelings that shifted slowly until they no longer meant the same thing they once did. For a long time I wondered whether the years we spent together had been real at all. That question used to haunt me. Because if the relationship ended in betrayal, it felt like the entire past had been built on something false. But eventually I realized something uncomfortable. Just because the ending was dishonest doesn't automatically erase every honest moment that came before it. At least not from my side. The memories where I felt happy, those feelings were real when I experienced them. The trust one gave her was genuine. The future I imagined with her was something I truly believed in. None of that disappears just because the outcome turned out differently than I expected. It just changes the meaning of the story. And maybe that's the hardest part about betrayal. Not the discovery itself. Not even the end of the relationship. It's the way it forces you to re-examine your past and decide what parts of it you're willing to keep. For a while, I wanted to throw everything away. Every memory. Every photograph. Every moment that reminded me of what the relationship used to be. But eventually I stopped trying to erase it. Because pretending those years never existed didn't feel honest either. They were part of my life. They shaped who I became. Even the painful ending taught me things I probably wouldn't have learned any other way. I learned that trust isn't something you can guarantee with promises. I learned that people don't always reveal the full truth about who they are, even to the people closest to them. And maybe most importantly, I learned that healing doesn't come from rewriting the past. It comes from accepting that some parts of it will always remain complicated. Even now, when I think back on that relationship, I don't feel the same anger I once did. What I feel instead is a question. One that I've never completely answered. Because when someone you loved betrays your trust, it forces you to look at your entire history with them in a different light. So here's the question I still find myself thinking about sometimes. If the person you trusted most ends up breaking that trust, does it mean the love you believed in was never real? Or does it simply mean that two people can experience the same story and remember it in completely different ways?